Welcome to my demonstration on the Norwegian M77 boot. The manufacturer of this boot is Alfa. There are two manufacturers. I believe there's also Protex. I believe that the one that is sold on Varusteleka, the Finnish surplus website, is also made by Protex. This is the boot that the Norwegian military used. Obviously, it was designed in 1976-77. I don't know if it's actually still in use. So I think I think the Alfa says it's made in Europe. I believe the Protex is made in Estonia. The Alfa might be made in Estonia as well. I do remember reading something that the Estonian Defense Forces or something of that nature might also use a similar version of this boot, if not the exact same. So this is a shell type boot. Basically, it's a single layer of leather. I'll go into more detail on that in a minute. So it just doesn't have any of those like fancy liners or anything else. It's a fairly, I guess, low-tech boot, other than the fact that it has a direct attached polyurethane type sole. So I believe there's two versions of this boot. This version, as I mentioned, is Alfa. I think you can tell because it's got the A on the bottom there. They could all be made in the same manufacturer, but I have actually owned both, at least two of the versions. And again, I could be wrong. The Varusteleka might contract it specifically, as far as I know. I'm just assuming, since they both said made in Estonia, that they were from the same place. But I guess first thing I should say is with all polyurethane boots, and I go over this in every one of the polyurethane videos, polyurethane is a foam material that has like micro bubbles, and that's what gives it cushion more so than what you'll find with most rubbers, unless you're going with like a blown rubber or maybe a Doc Marten, is that it's comfier. Typically, it's usually a little bit lighter weight, but it also has a condition called hydrolysis. Most of the manufacturers that sell this do not tell you about this. Basically, the foam breaks down over time. Something like your headphones, like the foam in the ear pads or the top, are also made of foams. You might notice after, years, sometimes 10, 15, that they start to crumble away. This is basically going to be the exact same thing. Hydrolysis is a process where it breaks down. It is accelerated with disuse. So one thing I've noticed is a lot of people buy boots that use polyurethane. There's also other foams like EVA foam, and they don't use it. And they end up saving it. They'll buy it. Probably a classic example is rain boots. They'll buy it. They'll only use it when it rains 3 times a year. Suddenly they've waited 9 months, they used it, and the boots completely fell apart. Now, there's other factors to know, because it's not like there's a specific lifespan to this. I think as well with the hydrolysis crap that I have to explain in these videos, there could be distribution or warehousing problems. One thing that's really nice about this version compared to some of the other polyurethane boots I've gone over, like Redback, Mongrel, Rossi's, is the more models you make, the more likely the model that you're looking at is going to be sitting in a warehouse for months, maybe years. But so if there's a problem with that, then I think you're going to have more likely a problem with hydrolysis. I've seen a lot of complaints with Blundstones, for example, where another polyurethane type boot, since they make their models overseas now, I believe in like Vietnam, Thailand, you've got them being made in one country, they're being shipped to perhaps Tasmania and Australia, and then Tasmania and Australia might ship them to somewhere in the US. It might sit on that place for a year or two. I actually bought a Blundstone for somebody, and I checked under the Insole, and it said it was manufactured a year and a half before, at least. I think it was 2018. This wasn't even that long ago, so it might have even been 2 years. But so hydrolysis is a big deal. Basically, my recommendation is use it regularly. For boots like these that are, these are Norwegian boots. I think it's the coldest area in Europe, if not one of them, in the mainland Europe at least. is that I basically during the summer months I'll use these for lawn mowing. I'll use them for yard work or the other uses I use a boot for. They're pretty much the only standard boot that I still own that I would say is like above the sort of 6-inch marker. So yeah, basically during if you got the rain boots that are made of polyurethane, and believe me, most of those rain boots now are made with some type of foam. Something like bikini boots. I believe the Croc boots are also made with EVA foam. Is that they will deteriorate if you don't use them, so you have to find some way to use them. At this point in my life, for how many boots I have tried on, I would only comfortably own 1 to 3 polyurethane type of footwear. If I was like at work and I was alternating boots because I wanted the leather to completely dry out and not rot, then maybe I'd have those 2 that I would be alternating. But unless you're using them on a fairly regular basis, you might want to look at something else if it's one of those once in a blue moon situations. I don't know why this explanation always ends up being about 5 to 10 minutes, but basically with hydrolysis is you'll notice cracking here, like underneath, and then you might notice it somewhere like on the sides, like in the cracks right there where it's molded to it. A lot of times too, you'll just see parts of the boot will just flake off. Again, the person will be like, oh yeah, well I bought these hiking boots and now it's hunting season a year and a half later, and I went hunting and I had to walk barefoot for several miles, or some story like that. I've actually noticed recently there's a Australian review website called productreviews.au, I think .com, and Redback's been getting a lot of negative feedback for that exact reason recently, that people's boots have been falling apart. I think Redback's done something about it. Sorry for the tangent. I think they've sort of made very limited amount of distributors in other countries like the US. In fact, the people I bought the Redback's boot for a pretty good price about 5 years ago now, I can't buy from anymore because they can't ship to the US. And one of those boots I think was stolen from me, and the other one I gave away when I had an accident with it, and they're still kicking. So I didn't have an issue with it, but I've seen a lot of negative feedback due to the hydrolysis. So there's your demonstration with that. Basically, the great thing about these, they only make one model. The great thing about Alfa, I don't think they distribute it anywhere. I think you have to buy it from Alfa's website. So you're not going to get problems with the breakdown. I think they fairly regularly have like one of those Walmart on-time shipping deals where it comes in and it ships out within a couple months instead of sitting somewhere in a warehouse for a couple of years. So this is a shell boot design. Again, it's made for very cold weather, and you're probably like, why is there no Insole in it? This is something that most American boots I've seen have something like this. They use liners, they use all this technology crap. Well, I think that leads to some problems. I think those designs, they end up being more expensive, they end up being heavier. I think this boot was just under 3 pounds, a pair of them. And so they're more expensive, there's more parts in them to break. Usually with Gore-Tex, it ends up breaking down at some point. I think a lot of people that have experienced the outdoors more, certainly I have, where you just come to a point where you're like, the boots will get wet at some point. And the nice thing about a shell boot like this is that when you are, going at night, you can just put it away in your tent, and chances are it's going to be way more dry in the morning than a boot that's got 3 layers of, thin sillet and all this other crap in it that's supposed to heat you up, but it might be soaking wet. Another issue I've had with Gore-Tex is not just it breaking down, but it'll get trapped between the leather and the Gore-Tex, and it'll end up rotting the leather as well, because it's not like it's going to wick from the inside to the outside. So I kind of look at the shell boot sort of philosophy as this is your outer layer, and you're like, well, why would you wear a leather jacket outdoors? you know, probably for the durability. It tends to be heavier, obviously, but it tends to block a good amount of water. It's fairly durable. There's just not very many good options. Maybe something like ballistic nylon, but I don't see many shoe manufacturers. In fact, the only one I think I've seen is Palladium, that used ballistic nylon or something like that can compete with, you know, leather's versatility. But basically, it uses that shell system. You know, this is your outer layer, and then you use an inner layer of one sock. You might have another sock under there, like a liner sock, like a really warm sock, like a polyester type sock. You might use like a Gore-Tex type sock. What's that other one? Neoprene. I think neoprene's usually pretty good for warmth. Or you might just use like one or two liners. This shoe does not come with a liner. I think I'll probably explain that at some point here, but basically this is what I get from the Feed and Sneed store. They cost me about $7. It's about 2 pairs. You can peel this one in half. Actually, I think this one that was in the boot, you could pretty much peel it in half, or you could just have an ultra thick layer. I usually just buy a bigger size and I cut it down. I'm sure if you really needed more heat, you could probably just get the biggest size you can and throw it in the washer so that it would boil a little bit more, although I can't confirm that. So anyways, basically you're using a layered system where you might use just a sock and a boot, a sock, boot, and insole. To me, if the design's really good, you can have a boot that's light, it's cheap, and it dries a little bit faster. The nice thing with a shell system is if my wool socks get wet, I have a backup. You know, I can replace a lot of these parts, and then at the end of the day, the boot itself can dry fairly well overnight compared to some of those other clunkier boots. I will say my one complaint with the shell boots, though, is, again, if the design isn't perfect, it can be a little bit too much for the system to sort of work. I guess you'd call it compliance with your system or program or whatever, program compliance. Because if it just takes, at this point, if it takes too much time to lace something up, I'm just not going to use it. And how well it fits into the sort of deal. In my opinion, these sort of gem greens, these are like 4-inch boots. They're so much easier. You know, if you're wearing 2 layers of socks, it's pretty easy to just shove your foot in there and then seal it up with these laces. Something like this, you have to really know what you're doing with sizing. You're going to get a lot of friction with that sort of flesh side of the leather as you're putting your foot in there. So, yep, basically, if I could change one thing, I would probably lower this to about 6 inches. I've considered just cutting it, but I might end up just upsizing as well. But I'll go more into that sizing issue later. Just overall, in my opinion, I'd rather use a system that uses probably a 5 or 6 inch boot. I think even when you get to 6 inches, you start to have a problem where the laces do more securing of like the heel or the ankle here, excuse me, and then they just get too loose down below because you're fighting to tangle all these laces up and hold them in their place. Again, I'll go more into that. I think the studs work a little bit better than too many eyelets. But yeah, my preference is about 4 to 5 inch, probably 5-inch boots. Yep. Okay, so I'm gonna go over one other comparison. Unfortunately, I didn't have my Protex with me. I've bought a few of the Protex, or what I think is the Protex boots, because I got them from Varusteleka. But I've had both of these models. If you end up buying both, it's all over the place. The Protex are the leather, in my opinion, was better than the Alphas. I've had 2 problems with the Alphas. One of the sizes I did order I ended up returning because it wasn't as thick as the other side of the boot. It looked like it was about 4 to 5 ounce leather, and I would say this is about a 7 ounce leather. The other problem I've had with the Alfa boots is I've put the sort of like waxing and cream type solutions on them, and the exterior here has a really hard time absorbing it. The conclusion I came to was that I'm pretty sure there's some sort of plastic topper to the leather here. Usually with, I don't know, that the whole full grain, top grain boot thing really just mystifies me. Because you would imagine that this is a full grain boot, because it usually, you'll actually see the animal hide on there. But I've seen one other company, I think it was Wesco, if you go to their custom boot, I think you can have sort of an embossed grain on the boot. And I don't know if that puts like a plastic finish on the top, but I could have sort of, you know, like fibings, or what are the other ones? You know, another leather conditioner, and it would just sit on the exterior and it would never absorb. Eventually, I just gave up, and what I did was I put all the conditioner on the inside. Usually when I'm going to break in a pair of boots, I'll condition them first, just because it helps soften them up, and it's less torture. But, yep, so it absorbed it fine when I put it underneath. I just didn't put too much on, or I think I did it in 2 layers. But the external just didn't absorb any of it. I'll go more into the scratches there in a second, but basically my point was that the Varusteleka M77 boot, I believe was, I like the leather more. It just felt like more of a natural leather. I don't believe it was a plastic finish, and I think it absorbs the conditioner fine. But the Alfa leather, it's just unusual. I'll go into more detail. The problem, though, I saw with the Varusteleka shoe, and this is why you're seeing the Alfa shoe instead, is I've seen quite a few reviews of the leather, the outsole cracking after about a year or less. If you actually go to their website and you look at the negative reviews, if you use Google Translate, you can see the English and the ones in Finnish. And there's been quite a few people that complained about what I was talking about earlier, hydrolysis. So I think that either Alfa has a better distribution, or they just have a better form of polyurethane that they use for their outsole. That I think that their outsole is going to last a little bit longer. I would imagine that mine's about 2 years old. I imagine it could last about, depending on your use, and if you use it regularly and to prevent hydrolysis, it could last between 3, 4 to 10 years. I've read a few accounts. This is anecdotal fallacy territory, but it said that they lasted about a decade or less. So the outsole would obviously be the most important thing for longevity, because once this cracks, it's going to absorb water, and what's the point of wearing a boot at that point? Basically, the outsole I prefer more with the Alfa. The leather I prefer more with the Varusteleka version. The sizing too with the Varusteleka version was way more loose than this one. I'll talk about the fit later, but it was easier to fit 2 layers of socks in the Varusteleka one for the same size. You can see the size there is European 41. I'm usually an American 9. If I don't wear socks, it's probably an 8.5. If I wore 2 socks, I probably, on these ones, should have just gone up to 42 or 43, and I probably will at some point. This is your millimeter measurement. I believe for their website, they say to measure your foot and then go 1.5 centimeters more. Don't quote me on that, check the website. But that'll lead to one of the other complaints, which is sizing between these 2 boots, or just sizing for a shell boot in general, because again, you want that. If I'm going to use this for summer, I'm probably not going to wear 2 outsoles, or 2 socks. I'll probably use 1 sock, and then I'll use a liner, you know, underneath for comfort and to soak up the juice. So if the design isn't perfect for that, you won't get that same versatility. It'll either be too floppy or too tight. But I'll go into that more. That's just my opinion between the two of them. The Protex or Varusteleka one, it felt like it was like a size bigger, at least. The fit was a lot more roomy. But unless they handle that hydrolysis issue, I'm not going to stick with that version. Okay, so I think I've explained everything I need to for the shell boot deal. With the outsole, I'll focus on that next. Again, it's polyurethane. It's really, you're not going to find anything else like this because most of the other companies, they'll have an outer part of the like outsole, and then what's the midsole that's attached to it. The best example you can find are in my other videos for the Australian pull-on boots. All of them had that. Redback did, Mongrel did. I think Rossi maybe had a version that had an exterior sort of polyurethane, or an exterior like nitrile and maybe an interior polyurethane. But most of them ended up going with that philosophy. And what you end up getting is this boot that's really tall, and it's not very wide. This one is about 1.25 inches. I think the Redbacks were about 1.5 inches. And to me, that was just a little bit too tall. For me, like, you want a balance between a minimal boot that's lighter in weight versus like a chunkier boot. Because typically these chunky boots, in my opinion, they're a little bit more comfortable for standing, more comfortable for carrying weight like a backpack. But obviously a lighter weight boot's easier to move around in. And yeah, so I mean, obviously it's not like I'm going to go running long distance with this. So the general, just to finish that Redback point, basically there's very little boots I've actually seen that it just uses sort of a one-layer direct attach system between the leather and the outsole. So this looks very much like what you would find in some sort of like welted boot. You know, it's just, you've got this, you've got the midsole, and then you've got the interior. This one you obviously don't see the midsole. The midsole's on the inside. I'll show you that with the flashlight in a second. But yeah, so you can get this boot that's, to me, what's more comfortable is a boot that's wide and the sole is wide. That seems to distribute pressure more than what you get with something like the Redbacks, where it's really tall, kind of like a clog. It's just not, it's more clunky, it's not as comfortable to move around in, it's a little bit heavier. So it's just a different philosophy, but obviously something like the Redbacks usually aren't going to be as wide as something like this or this. So these definitely end up working a little bit better as like a shell boot instead. But it's philosophy, and currently the trend that you'll see with tennis shoes and shit like that is it's got to look narrow because we don't want it to look like a clown boot. You know, we don't want to enter clown world. We don't want to look like the crazy person. So it's not very wide, but it's pretty tall, whereas this is sort of the opposite. I wish more boots followed this trend. For those that are looking for zero drop, again, this is about 1.5 inches. It's about 30 millimeters. This one's in the front is about 15. It's about 15 millimeters. It's basically identical to this one. This means that the front flex is pretty easy, but you also still have that heel. I usually prefer that a little bit more over like a wedge design. Basically, for anyone that's curious, I said this in the other video for the gym greens, that a shoe with a higher drop will be easier on the lower leg, foot, ankle, Achilles, calf, while directing more stress to the knees and hips. So you kind of get these, the whole point I'm trying to get here is you get these sort of extremists in the argument. You get these people that will say, no, you need a zero drop boot or shoe you know, this is what our ancestors did, follow our ancestors, you know, use the nature fallacy. You know, when a boot was originally designed, I believe, for stirrups and for, I believe, long marchals, that could just be totally made up, but that's just what I remember reading in a book. But, you know, and then you get this other side that thinks that, well, no, we need all these like orthotics and all this other shit that ends up giving you this like 2-inch boot. You know, and again, now you see a lot of these tennis shoes have these really thick wedges on them. You'll see a lot of like the trail runners will have the exact same as like the Redbacks. They'll have like a thick wedge in the heel part. Anyways, all I'm saying is that there's got to be a middle ground. Usually, what I said in the other video, the outsole's not very comfortable by itself. So if you create something like this shell boot design, if it's not too tall, you can create extra room in here to have something more comfortable like this, or like another insole. So you've got this replaceable part now that can be your comfort, and then this can just focus on durability and not have to lie to you by other means. I think I went in the other one sometimes, like, geez, if you look at Vibram soles like their Montana, that one has indentations in the upper part of the heel to try and lower the weight, but it's like, why would they have to make the sole so tall? Because rubber's already going to be the heaviest component in the boot. So, yep, that's that rant. But it's really nice. It's a lightweight boot. It's under 3 pounds for the pair. It's that low lift. I find that more comfortable with it being wide. I already said that. You got a Chevron on the outsole here. It's not like a Chevron you'll see on the Vibram. I think it's like the Vibram 700. Those ones have more channels to clear shit. When I've used this mowing the lawn, it's going to get stuck because there's no way for it to channel out between here and here. And so you'll just get this clump anyways. It's good for traction. I wouldn't say it's the best. I would say it's pretty much as good as most of your like Vibram type soles that won't deal well with sort of wet concrete surfaces as other shoes will. But yeah, stuff will get stuck, unfortunately. But it's not the end of the world. I don't have a problem with it. If it lasts as long as, you know, if it lasts 5 to 10 years, I'm happy with it. So, and I get good enough traction. The other thing I really like about this that you don't see on a lot of like welted boots, this one you got a very flat heel here. This one, it's sort of indentured at an angle there. Hopefully you can see that. I do like that because it makes it easier when you're sort of stepping to sort of flex to the front. You'll see this sort of on cowboy designs. Not sure what the indent is in here, but it's just this part here is more caved in than this part here. So, you know, this gives you a little bit of protection from scuffing that back as well. So that's all I'm going to say about the outsole. The midsole and insole here is pretty basic. You can't see it because it's not welted, and hopefully the flashlight shows you just got a leather piece in there. I don't know anything if it's best. Most of this stuff is chrome tanned. I'm going to guess the insole here is just a chrome tanned bit of leather, although it could be something else like fiberboard, some type of like cork. But then there's a pretty much useless leather insole in there. So they're not going to ship you any insole. So you're basically, the boot like this, the pro and the con, is that the pro is you customize it. The con is if you can't customize it perfectly, you're fucked. So it's kind of, to me, it's one of my favorite boots if when you can get that sort of Lego customization right. And I will say for the size I bought on the Varusteleka one, it was just a little bit easier to customize just because it just felt more open with that shell boot philosophy. All right, let's go on to the leather. You know, but the nice thing with the shell boot is you can customize with an orthotic. You can customize with felt wool. You can customize with whatever, you know, makes your experience more comfortable. And I do prefer that if, again, you can make the system work. And the only way to make the system work is with a good design. So leather, I mentioned, I'm pretty sure this one's got some type of plastic finish on it. I could be wrong, or it could just be extremely oil and water resistant. I would say it's a 7-ounce leather. It's a little thicker than the Gem Greens. Gem Greens, it says it's 2.2 centimeters, I think. Sometimes I mix those two up, might be millimeters, but I'm sure you'll understand and remind me in the comments. So this is in American terms, I think it's about a 7-ounce leather, whereas the Gem Greens is about, I would say, a 5 to 6. Most boots you buy, like Danners, what else is there? Danners, Red Wings, boots like that you're going to get are going to be less. They're going to be about 5 ounces, or 4 maybe. And then if you go into like the real big clunky work boots that you'll see wildland firefighters use, or sort of something of that nature, you're going to get more into the 7 to 8 ounces. I would say this is just under what you'll get from Wesco, White's, Nick's, those type of companies. But I don't like that plastic finish or whatever it is. That's elastic toe, where it's like you'll push the toe down and it'll flex back. It scuffs really easily. I'll go into the fit here in a second. But if a boot's not long enough to where you can actually sit on your foot, if you're kneeling forward, you end up just scraping the toe. You can see the damage there. And this is not with too much time. So, I mean, this is only 2 years. So, and I believe now that this is rubbed off, it's a little bit less water resistant. I've just noticed that my foot's been a little bit more waterlogged in snowy conditions. So, again, not the biggest fan of the leather. I think it's a good thickness. I got one, like I said, lemon, but yeah, the leather and the gusset here is a little bit thinner. I haven't had a problem with that. Sometimes they use thin leather and it ends up tearing in the corners. The nice thing about a gusset like this is as long as the water isn't penetrating the leather, it's not going to penetrate through the stitching, I guess, is because sometimes it'll go through the stitching as well. It's not going to go through the side. So, yep, not had a problem with that. Don't know if I'll mention this again. I don't really get the point of this fluffy stuff. I don't think it does anything. I don't know if it makes it easier to fit your foot in. I think it's just a bit goofy. I guess I don't have any sort of whites or nicks anymore. But I will say the gusset and the whites and the nicks, and it might be because it's goddamn little bit of fluff, but you would usually, when you broke the boots in, you would sort of fold it over itself like that, and then you get this really clean fit like this. With this design, I have not been able to successfully do that in a reasonable amount of time, and so I've had to, instead of doing this like folding method I'm showing you here, where it's like that, because it'll eventually break in like that, but then when you need it to open, it goes like this. I've done it more like this, but what ends up happening is you get this little indent here where it squeezes against it. I'll show you. With this one, you can see it pulling up the top there, but it just, I mean, it'll push in there, but it's not going to give me as tight of a fit. Pretty much on the design part anyways. For me, in general, when the boot's as tight as possible on your foot, you still want some distance because the leather will stretch, and other shit like that, so you want it more distant. And this one definitely, when it's laced up, it's not literally touching like this one is, almost touching. So I'm actually almost concerned when I'm talking about sizing up and using it like a shell boot, where I'm using 2 pairs of socks, that am I going to have enough to actually tighten this boot and have it be fairly fitted? That becomes a problem. And I will say I've tried other laces. I tried some like decent like nylon maybe paracord type laces that were pretty thick, and they, unfortunately, these very thin laces work the best because it's not breaching this little gap here and causing more shit between it. So I don't really know how to explain that, but the laces here do a pretty good job at holding the eyelets. In terms of fit, I usually like 4 eyelets max before it switches to something like studs. Don't know if they could change it to 3, probably not in this design, but usually I've even seen ones like these ones where once it gets to that 3rd eyelet, the 4th part, you end up getting this type of fit where it's really loose at the front here, because while you're trying to lace like that, and then you let go a little bit to go to the next lace, your foot pushes it back, and then this part ends up being more loose than you want to. So to each their own. Some people complain about bite right there where it's too tight. You could probably change it with your laces, and you can probably change it with the way you lace it. Like, I'm sure if the laces here were underneath, it would probably snug up a little bit more, but might cause more bite. These laces are actually pretty good. They crunch down pretty thin. This seems like paracord probably would work pretty well with these as well. But I do like the laces on these, even though I do think the fit could be improved. Yep, I think about 4's max. I like studs. Not a big fan of the speed hooks. I usually just prefer eyelets, but these ones actually work pretty well. There's another version of this. I said they only made 1 model, but I guess I was wrong. They make a pilot version. I think it's 1 inch shorter, but it's all eyelets, or it's all speed hooks or speed laces, whatever they're called. That to me just seems like it would be a nightmare. Basically, by the time you'd be lacing these upper eyelets, these lower ones would just be way too loose, and you wouldn't have a very good fit. My opinion, the fit, I want the fit strongest here, sort of where the arch is. I usually don't like them here because I don't want it to squeeze my toes any more than I need to, because that'll lead to them getting colder the more that they're snug together. And then you sort of get a fit like here across the instep with the heel. And then to me, the ankle is probably the least important. I mean, unless you want that ankle support from it. But a lot of times when you start getting to the ankle, you can get snug here, and which can cause bite, but it'll just be way too loose here where it's most important. That's the problem when you have a plethora of too much business going on. So ideally with a boot like this, especially a boot, I'd like to be able to squat, so I want that heel there if I'm squatting down, and it needs to be sort of long enough to brace itself, but it can't be too tall here because I think it messes with your balance. In terms of squatting, you'll see a lot of people that literally are doing the weights in terms of squatting. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about squatting like a Russian. But when you do see people squatting with weights, they'll typically use Converse because it's a flat, like no drop type of deal. And with this, I would rather have that minimal drop. I think it's just a little bit easier to squat. I think the taller it is, the more it fucks with your balance. So, but for the sort of fit design, I'd like to be able to squat. And I would also, like I mentioned, I'd like to be able to kneel on my toe. This one's it's just not, it needs to be a little bit longer for my foot. I've measured my foot. It's about 10 inches. That's going to look like trash. Just trust me here, friends. Basically, it's about 10 inches, 10 to 10 and a quarter. Again, I'm about an 8.5 without socks. I'd probably be about a 9 with socks. If I was doing the double sock method with an insole, sometimes I consider just whether to go to 10 instead of and just skip over 9.5. But the sort of formula I'm experimenting on now is if my foot's about 10 inches, I'd like the sole to be about 12 inches. This outsole here is about 11 and about 3/4. So I would say it's just under what I would ideally need, especially for that. Again, I think my biggest con with the fit is when all that shit is done and dusted, it's too much of a hassle to get your foot in here because I just think it's too long. It's just too long. And then and then snugging it up. This snugs up almost perfectly, and I just don't have much room in there that I would be concerned that if I sized up, which is what I should be doing, that those 2 socks and an outsole, it would be too loose of a fit. I think I explained just about everything I need to there. I will say so basically what I'm talking about with the fit is I want that length long enough to be able to do those 2 things I mentioned, squat and kneel. And I just think, you kind of want that versatility of how you're maneuvering around in nature, else why the hell am I wearing a boot? But so then I use size up because you want something longer, but then you have to contend with issues like I was saying here with the eyelets and being able to have that versatility of a shell boot. And then the other complaints I have is the heel here, it's just too loose. I'm considering using these as a shell boot, and not only because it's a lot shorter, it's 4 inches versus, I can't remember if this one's like 8 to 10. It's about 8, it's a little over 8. So it's much easier to fit something in there, but the heel will also fit a lot better when this one's all snugged up. It's just this center here, it's just a little bit too loose for me. Even with probably 2 socks, there's just too much play. I have a little bit weaker Achilles tendon, and I can definitely feel it more so than the other boots, unless I lace everything up perfectly. So again, it's like you're playing a game of Legos, and you've got to get that fit perfectly. So to kind of go over things, my 3 major complaints with this is the leather. I think the Protex leather my experience with it has been better. I don't know if this has a plastic finish, but I'm not a big fan of it. The lacing gap that I explained, if I changed anything with it, I probably would keep the 4 eyelets here. I would probably make this a little bit further apart. Something, like I said, something like this where you can't just snug it up too much. I think it just needs just a tiny amount more. Another thing, I would probably, again, change the gusset here. I'd probably just remove that. I think it would work fine. Lacing it like that, because that gives you that protection if you're whacking your leg there and your shin. But it allows it to also be snugged up more. This one just makes the eyelets here a little bit too hard to snug up. And then I would try and, sorry, I just kicked the camera, mess with this sort of heel thing here as well. So those are the 3 things: heel, lacing gap, and leather. But truthfully, this is probably my favorite boot. I think unfortunately, I no longer own the Redback Everests, but of sort of 5-inch or longer boots, I would say the Redback Everest and this has been my 2 favorite boots for when I need them. Yep, just don't think I can beat it. I don't think I can beat the versatility. The Redback Everest as well. Unfortunately, I actually considered getting it again, but I don't think they sell it. I've been told they don't sell it stateside anymore. So that one had a really weird liner. It was pretty, non-existent. I think it was like chambrel or some type of material that was supposed to wick it. But it did a really good job. Yep. So I liked it probably as a smaller boot. And if you definitely like that more cushiony rather than wider or customized fit, I would say the Redback's going to be way fucking easier. Again, something that's 4 or 5 inches is a lot easier. I think if you're looking for a boot, in my opinion, I think the standard you'll see for leather boots is about 6 inches. Most of those trail runners are about 5 inches. This is about 4. This is about 8. I think 8 I think anything more than 8 is too much. I think 8 is probably, you can usually tell because it's about the same amount of eyelets. I think 8 is a little too much. I think it starts to get into the way of the calf here. And then you want your lace really snug. If they wanted to improve, I've seen with some of the more technical boots, they'll do sort of a V shape in here, because you can see that this thing, it's already forming this this crease that you'll see with a lot of these leather boots. But because when you're lacing them, it looks like this, right? So if you end up cutting a V in here, you'll end up seeing you don't have to contend with the leather, and you can get a tight fit. One of the hardest things I've seen is when these boots are trying to get from this lace here, sort of controlling an instep, to something that's going between the laces here. So I think that V shape might improve that as well. But basically, going back to my other spiel, so I would say, yeah, most trail runners are about 5 inches, so about here. And I think that's the ideal, just because I think it gives you some ankle support. You know, something like this gives you none. It just gives you the acknowledgement that you're moving your ankle to the extreme sides of the leather. But, you know, you pretty much use something like this because you just don't want that splash effect to go into your socks or some thorn to catch onto it. You know, though, you can make it work with something like gaiters pretty well, too. So, I think 6 inches is when you start to get this issue with this gap here, especially, where you can get a really good tight fit here, but it's just really sloshy in the foot there. So, that's just my opinion. I wish they remade these. I think it would be really cool if they did like a modern version. Okay, none of the technology bullshit, but made it a little bit shorter, maybe change the leather a little bit, and then change that fit. I love the studs. I've never had an issue with them. They tend to hold the lace really well. I think they shorten the life of the lace a little bit. I have not had an issue with these ones. I don't know what they're made of, but I'm going to guess it's not cotton. But yep, that's just my opinion there. I think it should probably be between 5 to 7 inches. The Pilot version, I think, is 7-inch height boot. But if you're looking for similar shell boots, I should probably just mention this. So there's not many that use this philosophy. I think many people would consider this like a obsolete or older type of system. But there's a few out there that still do that sort of shell boot design. Some have like a completely different deal. I think the most obvious you'll find is the bean boot. How the bean boot works is there's an entire outsole of like rubber, but sometimes I think they'll actually use polyurethane, but people will just call it rubber. Basically, when the sole wears down, they just stitch a new sole to here. But what the advantage you get is you get rubber, you know, instead of leather here. So it's going to be pretty much waterproof down there. But at some point it's going to break down. It's probably going to be heavier. I don't know how much LL Bean boot repairs are, but they'll do them in-house, and I don't think it's too expensive. There's another company in the U.S. There's Schnee's. I think it's in Montana. They sell a lot of hunting boots. They have that same shell boot philosophy. Again, your warmth comes from your socks and all the other shit you're going to wear in the middle. But it's going to have some like serious rubber stitched around here. There might even be another, I think they're actually called pack boots for that, PAC boot. That's something else you might be interested in. I believe the Schnee's is pretty heavy though. I think another company that does it as well is Kennetrek, Kennetrek. There might be a few others. I think they're sort of more Pacific Northwest companies that'll do those. But I've heard the complaint from the bean boots that they can be a little bit slick, that you wouldn't really want to use it for ice. I don't know so much about the Schnee's. I've never actually worn them, but I do know that they're going to be about 5 pounds. So another company, there's a European company called Lundhag. They've got a model called the Park and then the Forest. And the Park is a shorter version, and then the Forest is a taller version. I think it's about 8 inches versus 6. Theirs is going to look the most similar to this, but it's got that same design. It's going to have that thing where it's like you basically cut off this part and you're going to replace it with rubber or polyurethane. I think theirs is, I think they specifically switched to polyurethane. I think they call it like cellulite or something. I think that if you're wanting a lightweight boot and you like that design more, especially if you live in Europe, because it'll be easier to repair, you know, to ship them, I would definitely look at the Lundhag Park and Forest. I do believe they use some polyurethane in the outsole, And I believe that they're new. Like, I think their design is going to be polyurethane because it's going to be lighter weight than rubber. So like from here to here, again, all this shit down here is going to be polyurethane. You're going to have a rubber outsole, you probably have a polyurethane strip there, and then a rubber sort of heel cap there. But I think you'll get a similar boot. I think it'll probably be a lot more stiff. And at some point it'll wear out. And that's the hard thing with polyurethane. I think with rubber, it's a little bit easier to detect, okay, my boot's probably going to die in the next 1,000, 500 miles or something like that. Whereas with polyurethane, it could just crack, especially when people go to those review websites and they're like, well, I used my boot once after, 9 months and it fell apart. You might have that issue as well. And then you're going to have a bad day. So there's other boots like this. Basically, a single layer leather boot. I mean, geez, you can find a Palladium, which I don't think most people would consider a hiking boot. And you can find a version of it with a single layer of leather. I think it's called unlined. Most of them, for whatever reason, they put cotton liners in them. But I think any boot like that can serve as a shell boot. And ideally, you would probably just want to upsize it, especially if you're trying to find warmth with it as well. One thing I said in the other video too, I think a lot of people have a misconception with wool, using it as a sock or an insole. But truthfully, I think wool will deal well with a lot of temperatures that might actually block you from a lot of heat. Now, would I use this boot in the summer? No, probably not. But I might use something more like this, and then use some wool inside of it, wool socks, and then these wool felted insoles here to, deal with the inclement weather, and then I can just remove them all at night for them to all dry out. So that's about it. Again, I'd give these boots about a 4. I haven't really found a perfect boot. I think the fit is the main thing with this boot that I've had a hard time with, leather next to it. Again, I think if the other boot I've tried that I would say is closest that I like the most, that would also be a 4 is Redback Everest, if you can get it. I wish they sold it in the US. I think the Lundhag Park would be my next recommendation if you like that shell boot that's actually got a layer of leather as this sort of lower of the upper. Another example I can give you if you have no fucking clue what I'm talking about is if you look at whites, they can resole everything that's like above here, I think. And you'll see them remove it because I'll replace the leather here. But basically, they're doing the same thing. They're taking the leather, but the leather instead stitches in a circle around a piece of rubber or polyurethane. So, yep, those would be my 3 alternative recommendations. Or I would just go with a lower boot. I'm definitely trying more. I think using a shell boot like a Palladium unlined leather, I'll try that at some point. Maybe a ballistic nylon. I have a version of theirs that uses it. What else is there? Certainly there's other trail boots. I've been looking at Zero, although when you start getting into those synthetic materials, I get worried that either the outsole is going to be shit because it's going to be made of EVA foam, and then you get those people on the internet that tell you, oh, well, it falls apart, or the foam's gone in 500 miles, so you need to replace it, or just looking at something like Zero. But again, I'm concerned about even if like with Zero, I think they guarantee the Outsole for 5,000 miles, but I don't think the upper is going to last 5,000 miles is the problem. I don't know why they don't just make them of a single layer of something like ballistic nylon. They got to put all this mesh and all this other fancy details in it. But yep, I think that's all she wrote. Cheers. About 4.5 stars, 4.5 stars, or 4 out of 5 stars is probably the review. I'd give this one. Again, I haven't found the perfect boot, so goodbye.